Hello and welcome to the Farming Week, the podcast from Agriland that keeps you up to date with all the latest in Irish agriculture. I'm Charles O'Donnell and I'm joined by Agriland journalist Aisling O'Brien. Well, the past week has seen a number of important developments across several sectors. For example, in the machinery sector, we saw John Deere announcing that it has reduced production of tractors and laid off some staff at some of its North American plants due to a fall in sales. Meanwhile, closer to home in agricultural politics, the Irish Cattle and Sheep Farmers Association has appointed its Animal Health and Welfare Chairperson, Hugh Farrell, as its new General Secretary, replacing Eddie Punch, who stepped down from that role earlier this year to run in the European elections. But we're going to start this week with the announcement of the long-awaited National Biomethane Strategy, which it is hoped will offer farmers an outlet for their on-farm organic manure, while also offering a potential income stream. Aisling, can you take us through the details on this?
Yeah, so what we're being told here, Charles, is that this National Biomethane Strategy will be agri-led and farmer-centric. So it was brought to Cabinet this week by Minister for Agriculture, Food and the Marine, Charlie McConalogue, and Minister for the Environment, Eamon Ryan. So the plan is going to be supported with an initial biomethane capital grant. That's going to be valued at €40 million. And it's going to encourage early adopters in the industry, we're told, with additional funding to be provided later as the strategy is implemented over the coming years. Now, the strategy outlines 25 actions to develop and grow the biomethane sector here, and it's divided into 5 different pillars. You can read all about those on Agriland. But essentially, the nuts and bolts and what it means for us is that this strategy is planning to produce zero carbon homegrown gas from grass and organic waste, which it's hoped, as you said, will provide another outlet for farmers in terms of being able to earn an income. Now, the government's target here is to increase biomethane production in the country to 5.7 terawatt hours, which is 60% of Irish homes' gas usage. Now, this will all need about 200 AD plants or anaerobic digestion plants to be built across the country, which is a massive undertaking, it has to be said. And the land area required to grow that silage to feed these AD plants will come from land that is already growing grass. But there will be some displacement of livestock likely according to the strategy. But this impact could be reduced with the incorporation of legumes such as white or red clover as well. Now, according to the strategy, slurry from 1.3 million cattle will be required to meet this 2030 target. That represents around 20% of all winter cattle slurry produced in Ireland. And we're being told that a roughly equal mix of slurry and silage will be required for feeding these AD plants. Now, other agricultural feedstocks for AD which could be incorporated include poultry litter and manure, while potential non-agricultural feedstocks could include the likes of food waste from the brown bin that a lot of householders would be familiar with, and also sewage sludge as well. So there is an expression of interest call from the government now for this biomethane capital grant of €40 million. And Minister Charlie McConalogue said from an agricultural perspective, he said benefits have been identified such as alternative farm income avenues through the production of renewable energy, the availability of digestate to reduce fertiliser costs, and also providing alternative land use options for farmers that are looking for diversification options as well. Now, it is interesting to note from an emissions point of view that the agriculture sector, Charles, can't actually benefit directly from the emissions savings from biomethane generation. But the strategy says that it will present an opportunity for livestock farmers to diversify their activities, reduce emissions from animal waste, and replace chemical fertiliser with this bio-based fertiliser that will be produced as part of the AD process. Now, the strategy envisages that most developments in the sector will occur in rural Ireland due to the nature of the feedstocks being supplied by farmers. This means that the development of the sector could result as well, they're saying, in about 3,000 jobs in or around that would be both direct and indirect as a result of this. And there is as well, to develop this sector, the strategy has a renewable heat obligation contained in it. And that is going to incentivise the use of biomethane in the heating sector, we're being told. And finally, the government are set to establish a group. We love a good implementation group, Charles, when we get a report. So we're going to get a high-level biomethane implementation group, which will be under the Department of the Environment. That'll be set up to support the implementation of this strategy and target delivery of the plan, we're being told, and to seek further funding as well from the Infrastructure, Climate and Nature Fund for expenditure here, because over 200 AD plants, they're not going to be cheap to build and not going to be cheap to develop, that's for sure.
Absolutely, Aisling. And while all this, I suppose, sounds like a big step forward, what's the reaction been like? Is this kind of been met with the same level of enthusiasm that the government is expressing?
I think rarely with these type of announcements sometimes, Charles, but it seems to be a level of healthy skepticism is how I would determine it. The IFA president, Francie Gorman, said that a lot more than 40 million euro is going to be needed if the government is serious about reaching these targets by the end of the decade. And he said there was also other logistical issues that have to be ironed out, including the classification of the byproducts such as digestate. The outgoing MEP, Billy Kelleher, who is seeking re-election in the European elections, believes that this will play a key role in retaining the nitrates derogation for Ireland, this biomethane strategy. But he did stress as well that it has to be followed up by investment, speedy planning decisions and certainty for farmers if it's to have any real value, essentially. And Billy Kelleher has long been a critic of Ireland when it comes to AD and AD development, has called us a laggard on multiple occasions when it comes to our European counterparts and how far ahead they are with the development of AD as well. And I suppose looking more towards the industry reaction, the managing director of Local Power, Pat Smith, said that generous grant supports are going to be needed for additional on-farm slurry and digestate storage under this strategy. And he said that 40 million won't be near enough to meet the production targets and that significant additional funding will be needed in the years ahead. And IRBIA, which is the Irish Bioenergy Association, they represent some key stakeholders in the gas and renewable energy sector. They welcomed the publication of the strategy, but they called for further market certainty to attract investment because, Charles, these type of plants, they cost a lot of money and sometimes they can get tied up in planning processes, and that's something as well that will be a cause for concern in the years ahead as well. Will these run into environmental planning concerns, and I think the government is aware of that, and they're saying that there has to be a public awareness campaign when it comes to the role of AD and what biomethane is. I think a lot of people in Ireland are going to do a lot of learning about biomethane in the years ahead if the government has its way, and they need to actually, because if we're going to reach this target, we need these plants to be built. But, there is, I suppose, a need to ensure that these developers have the confidence to go ahead with these plants and with these projects because they're costly, they're time consuming, but you need to be almost guaranteed or near guaranteed that you are going to be successful in your bids to build these and to reach this target of around 100 new AD plants. And they will become a feature of the Irish landscape in the not too distant future if the government has its way.
Now, you might remember a number of weeks ago on the Farming Week, we covered another government plan, which was itself a long time in the making. And that was a support payment for landowners and farmers impacted by ash dieback, a highly destructive disease of ash trees. But as we saw outside Leinster House this week, Aisling, ash plantation owners still feel a great deal of frustration over that issue.
Yeah, so this demonstration was organised by the Limerick and Tipperary Woodland Owners Limited Group, and they gathered outside Leinster House on Wednesday to demand action from the government on ash dieback and I suppose a lot more respect for the farmers and forestry owners that have been impacted by this devastating disease. Now, the government has announced the Reconstitution Ash Dieback Scheme, which is due to run until 2027. And under that scheme, owners of ash forestry that are impacted by ash dieback will receive €2,000 a hectare for site clearance and between €3,800 a hectare and €8,500 a hectare for replanting, depending on the chosen forest type. Now, a climate action performance payment, a cap with a double P in this instance, of €5,000 a hectare will be paid to each grant-aided ash forestry owner who will either have to essentially clear the ash or replant through one of the department's ash dieback reconstitution schemes. But the forestry owners are very disappointed with this, Charles. They say it falls an awful long way short of the losses that their members have incurred. And the chair of the LTWO, Simon White, said that affected forestry owners are fed up at this point and that this announced package, which was worth some €79.5 million, it's not going to be acceptable to them. And here is some of what he had to say outside Leinster House to Agriland.
The Minister and the Department of Agriculture have continuously treated people with complete disrespect. And we're fed up. Enough is enough. Ash dieback is seen as the issue that needs to be dealt with in order to keep confidence in forestry. Confidence in forestry in private growers, private landowners is gone. It's because it's been mismanaged by the department. Every issue has been dealt with unfairly, inequitably, and what we're asking for is people to be dealt with fairly.
So as you heard there, that is chair of the LTWO, Simon White there, speaking to Rubina Freiberg outside Leinster House as part of their demonstration this week. Charles, he said that we do need to get young people into planting trees because nothing can do the job better than trees when it comes to climate change. And he feels that a small investment by government to tackle ash dieback will pay back hugely because Ireland will face enormous fines for missing its planting targets every year for the last 10 years. And, as he said there in the clip, the confidence in the forestry sector has been enormously impacted by the controversies surrounding ash dieback and what is perceived as the failure of the government and the delays by the government to deal with this issue. It's not an easy issue to deal with, but I suppose the forestry owners see this as a devastating disease that's not of their making, and they have incurred huge losses with it. And it has to be welcomed that the government has finally come forward with a concrete plan here and a payment plan. But the forestry owners feel it's falling far short of the mark. So it will be interesting to see if there are any changes to these payments. And this all comes against the backdrop as well. There is an ash dieback task force of which Simon White is actually a member. And Senator Pippa Hackett, who of course is the Minister of State for Land Use and Biodiversity in the Department of Agriculture, described the first meeting of that task force this week as constructive engagement within that meeting. And she said that they will meet 4 times a year for a period of up to 3 years, for the remainder of this new scheme and I suppose to oversee its implementation as well. But it will be interesting to see how that process goes down with government as well over the coming weeks ahead, Charles.
Absolutely, Aisling. And it was also interesting to hear Simon White mention the potential threat of bark beetle. I think his comments were along the lines of, why would people replant when there's possibly another threat just around the corner, which could also devastate their plantations. So I suppose would it be fair to say there's a good deal of fear among planters at the moment, and maybe something more fundamental is required apart from the funding, the money, which is obviously very welcome, but maybe something a bit more fundamental as well.
Yeah, the bark beetle is something that we have covered extensively on Agriland, and the IFA have made repeated calls for the temporary suspension of imports of timber from Scotland. Now, there's a pest-free area in Scotland, and this bark beetle has not been detected in that area. And the department have said that they are inspecting every single consignment of timber that arrives into the country and doing checks. They check a couple of different places in the consignment for these bark beetles. But I suppose, Simon White voicing serious concerns and reservations that if this beetle arrives into this country, I suppose given the response to maybe ash dieback by the government, they don't have much confidence that the government is prepared to deal with it, because that little critter could do an awful lot of damage to our forestry sector here, Charles. And it is something that we have to be incredibly cautious and careful about when we are importing timber. But the department and Minister McConlogue are happy at the moment with the biosecurity measures that are in place, and they're in contact, they say, all the time with the Scottish authorities. But that beetle hasn't been detected detected yet in the pest-free area from where we get our imports, but it has been found in other areas of the UK as well. So that is a cause for concern and something that we have to keep a very close eye on as a country and a forestry sector.
Absolutely, Aisling. We're going to move on now, and one item that keeps cropping up, and not without good reason, is water quality and the associated issue of the nitrates derogation. Yesterday, Wednesday, we saw Dairy Industry Ireland attend a meeting of the Joint Oireachtas Committee on Agriculture, Food and the Marine to talk about Ireland's compliance with the Nitrates Directive. And Aisling, DII's Director Conor Mulvihill had some interesting comments to make.
Yes, he did, Charles, that's for sure, because the clock is ticking here. Ireland's current nitrates derogation is due to expire on January 1st, 2026. The European Commission will be carrying out a review of it next year. And of course, it'll all be dependent on our water quality results and improvements to water quality, on us retaining the 250 in some areas. And we did see that midterm review resulting in a drop to 220 in some areas around the country where water quality levels were not to the satisfaction of the EU Commission. Now, of course, there's been repeated calls from within industry to allow us time for the science and for the measures that farmers are undertaking to take hold and that we can see the results on the ground. But as you said, this is a very, very hot topic at the moment. And not only Dairy Industry Ireland appearing before the Oireachtas Committee this week, they were joined by Meat Industry Ireland and co-ops Dairy Gold, Kerry Group and Tierlawn as well. And they were all highlighting the potential fallout to the sector if there were any changes to the nitrates derogation. Now, DII and its director, Conor Mulvihill, as you said, they presented a 10-point action plan, and they've called on the government to give that plan their backing because they believe it could secure the European Commission's approval for Ireland's derogation. And the top priority in that action plan, Charles, is a request for Taoiseach Simon Harris to chair a cabinet subcommittee that would coordinate key government departments tasked with securing the derogation, because like all things in Ireland, the derogation and the responsibility for it actually goes well beyond the Department of Agriculture, and it goes into a number of different departments. So this is, it's a legitimate ask, that's for sure. And the action plan also sets out that there must be a clear focus on water quality improvement within the requirements of the Board B quality assurance schemes for all sectors. And DII said it wanted to take ownership of this derogation issue and to bring a solutions-based approach working with partners across the state. And Conor Mulvihill, the director of DII, voiced major concerns about what he felt was a lack of resources being put towards this issue from the government. Have a listen.
There is a real concern within the industry that government has not yet allocated the necessary resources to address this critically important issue. Unless we collectively work to an agreed action plan to improve water quality across all sectors and thereby preserve the derogation, our capacity as an industry to remain efficient and competitive internationally will be fatally undermined and damaging to the overall Irish economy.
So that's Conor Mulvihill there addressing the Joint Oireachtas Committee. And as I said, there is a 10-point action plan. And along with this new cabinet subcommittee as well, they're also calling for a clear government-led strategy to be built around a national farming for water movement. And as part of that movement, they said that every farmer should be supported to develop a nutrient use score. And they've also appealed for closed periods for the application of organic manure to land to be respected by all farmers, and that chemical nitrogen allowances should be reviewed in line with the Water Quality Working Group recommendations. And there's more on that 10-point plan on Agriland, but I suppose they did point to the fact that there is another adjustment to Ireland's nitrates derogation. So if, for instance, the areas that are in 250 drop to 220, or those who are in 220 drop to the lowest level of 170, which is the level across the board in Europe where there isn't derogations, they said that the impact will not only be economic, that, there'll be a social impact here. There could be huge implications across the sector and beyond. And we are already seeing the impacts, Charles. Dairy farmers are trying to protect their herds, protect their cow numbers. They are buying land. They're making sure that they, can keep their animals as much as they can. And, a lot of frustration out there, amongst farmers about the nitrates derogation and the response, by the government and maybe by certain parts of industry as well, that maybe this call was being made for a long time in advance of the drop and down to 220 in some areas. And, there seems to be a coordinated effort now, but it doesn't hurt, I suppose, that there is a local and European elections on the horizon as well, and no doubt a general election to follow at some point.
Yeah, well said, Aisling. And I suppose it would really be a statement of intent from the government if that cabinet subcommittee was formed as a DII you're asking for, but whether or not that'll happen is a separate question altogether. But sticking with the water quality issue, Aisling, we've seen today that Teagasc has launched a new initiative on that very issue.
Yes, Charles, we're full of plans and strategies this week on the Farming Week, that's for sure, because Teagasc this week has launched its Better Farming for Water campaign, and we're being told that aims to support farmers to reduce loads of nitrogen, phosphate, sediment and pesticides entering our watercourses across the country. And it's a 7-year campaign, and it has 8 actions in total. And we're being told that it provides a structured and relatable approach for farmers to effectively engage with improving water quality. So what is contained in this plan? Well, reducing purchased nitrogen and phosphorus surplus per hectare is one of them. Ensuring soil fertility is optimal for lime application. Also looking at application of fertilizer and organic manure at appropriate times and conditions. Having sufficient slurry and soiled water storage capacity on farms. Fencing off water courses to prevent access of cattle to those water courses. Managing and minimizing nutrient loss from farmyards and from roadways. Promoting the targeted use of mitigation actions such as riparian margins, buffer strips, sediment traps to mitigate nutrient and sediment loss to water, and maintain overwinter green cover to reduce nutrient leaching from tillage soil. So they're the 8 aspects of this campaign, Charles. A lot of farmers out there might say, we're doing that already, but maybe not all of them are. So look, it's no harm that Teagasc are bringing forward another way for us to improve our water quality. And as you said, all feeding into this urgency to protect Ireland's nitrates derogation into the future.
Moving on now, but staying on an environmental vein, the EPA said this week that the agricultural sector and Ireland generally will not meet its greenhouse gas emissions reduction target for 2030. Many listeners will be aware that the agriculture sector has to cut its emissions by 25% by 2030 relative to 2018 emissions. Aisling, based on current trends, how far wide of that mark is agriculture likely to be by 2030?
Well, 25 is the magic number, Charles, by the end of the decade, as you said. But the Environmental Protection Agency research this week has shown that the total emissions from the agriculture sector are projected to decrease by somewhere between 1% and 18% by the end of the decade. And they said that this will be achieved by a range of measures such as limiting nitrogen fertilizer use, moving to different fertilizers and cattle feed additives. Now, in order to achieve a reduction closer to the higher end of that prediction, that's 18%, which is a good way off the 25% target, the EPA has stressed that most of the measures in the Climate Action Plan, the Teagasc Marginal Abatement Cost Curve, also known as MAC, and other programs would have to be in place. And they said that this would have to be under what they called an ambitious scenario. So they have 2 different categories, essentially, and 2 different ways of looking at this. So they have, with existing measures, they said that emissions from agriculture and transport are projected to decrease by 1% and 5% respectively. And then with the more ambitious, with additional measures scenario, agriculture and transport are projected to decrease by 18% and 26% respectively over the period. Now, the EPA confirmed that Ireland, as you said, is projected to achieve a reduction of up to 29% in total greenhouse gas emissions by the end of this decade. But the target is 51%, Charles. So 29 versus 51, it's a big gulf, and not good news for the government on that front. But again, it's when the majority of actions outlined in the Climate Action Plan are included, so we do need to undertake and adopt all of the actions that we're being told to. And that is only going to result in an 18% reduction according to the EPA. And look, some of the climate action plan measures include a reduction in crude protein in pig diets, all slurry stores to be covered by 2027, drying of poultry manure, a further 1% reduction in crude protein content of dairy cow concentrates in the grazing season, limiting sales of straight urea to 20,000 tonnes per annum from 2025. And more, I suppose, looking at, methane emissions and fertilizer sales and spring crops and everything like that. And obviously it is well short of the emissions reduction targets, that in its highlighting the scale of the effort that is going to be required from not only farmers, but from all sectors across society, Charles, in order to achieve the 29% overall and 18% for the agriculture sector emissions reductions. And, it isn't the 25% that we've been hoping for, according to the EPA, as things currently stand.
Now, not to be overly pessimistic, Aisling, the Irish Farmers Association has said that it believes that meeting that 25% reduction target by 2030 is still possible. What's the IFA's reasoning behind that?
Yeah, so the IFA's Environment Committee chairperson, John Murphy, said that the reality is that some other additional measures set out in the Climate Action Plan for Agriculture were excluded from the emissions projections report produced by the EPA. And he said this is because additional data is required to account for a potential 1.5 million tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalent reduction due to planned diversification measures. And he said hopefully that can be resolved by next year and that we will see these diversification measures included within the projections report. And that then will provide a clearer picture of the potential of the sector. And the IFA Environment chairperson said that although farmers are adopting new measures to reduce emissions on farms, a whole of sector implementation is needed if the targets are to be achieved. So I think there's some common ground there between the EPA and the IFA that we do need to see an uptake of these measures and adoption of these measures. And also it must be said, Charles, before we leave that as well, that, carbon capture and storage on farms is also an important factor in all of this. And that's something that the sector needs to be given credit for too. And I know that there is research going on that at the moment, but it is a bugbear for farmers out there that they aren't being given credit for the amount of capture of carbon on their farms, in their soils and in their hedgerows.
Finally this week, we're going to talk about farm schemes. And the Department of Agriculture has told advisors working with farmers in the Agri-Climate Rural Environment Scheme, ACRES, that the area monitoring system will be used to check certain measures under the scheme. Aisling, can you tell us a bit more about this?
Yes, Charles. So we have spoken about the so-called eye in the sky previously on the podcast, and the satellite-based area monitoring system, AMS, it has been used in recent years to ensure compliance with different schemes. It has been used for BIS as well in the last 12 months. So the department has announced that AMS will be used for 2 acres measures this year. That will be the extensively grazed pasture and the winter bird food measures. So the system is based on regular and systematic observation, this AMS system, and it uses the Copernicus Sentinel satellite data that is floating around in the sky above us all the time. And for extensively grazed pasture, the AMS will check for any mowing events between the restricted period of March 15th to July 1st. And for winter bird food, AMS will be used to check for any cultivation events that have taken place before May 31st. Now, the AMS system can be complemented then with follow-up checks on the ground by an inspector to provide further clarification, as we've seen for other schemes as well. And separately, the department might also send a notification. We've reported on Agriland about those notifications that were sent out to farmers last year as well, when these so-called red parcels turned up through the AMS system as well. And that will involve the applicant, the farmer or their advisor, submitting geotagged photographs using that AgriSnap app that was developed by the department as well. Look, as we're on acres before we leave it, If you want to make any online amendments to acres, the clock is very much ticking because the deadline is tomorrow, May 31st, without incurring a penalty. And amendments to acres may include rectifying incorrectly claimed land or adding a new parcel or plot. Late amendments after that deadline will be accepted online by the department, but as is usual, they will incur a penalty. So check that out and get those in as soon as you possibly can. And the closing date for that, for those late applications, is June 10th.
And Aisling, we've seen developments across certain other schemes in recent days as well, haven't we?
Yes, Charles, that's true. So we heard this week from IFA Livestock Committee Chair Declan Hanrahan that IBR testing is not expected to feature in the new suckler welfare scheme. He made the comments at a meeting on the farm of Rosaleen O'Reilly in Quinn in County Clare as part of the IFA's Enough is Enough campaign. Of course, we've previously seen tractor protests and county council meetings being addressed by members of the IFA as part of that campaign. But back to Declan Hanrahan, anyway, and he told us that the new welfare scheme, which will replace the National Beef Welfare Scheme, will have a budget of €20 million and will be funded through the Irish Exchequer. Now, IBR testing was among the two required actions under last year's National Beef Welfare Scheme. That was much to the annoyance of the farm organisations who felt that that money was going to third parties rather than farmers. So we heard that the new scheme is expected to consist of a €50 payment per eligible calf up to 40 animals. And the IFA said that they're working to increase that upper limit of 40 animals on this scheme. And it'll be broken down, that €50 payment, as follows. There'll be €35 an animal for meal feeding and €15 for vaccinations. And that will be clostridial vaccination or respiratory vaccination. And a lot of farmers would be already doing that, so it mightn't be that taxing an ask for them. And the scheme is going to be available to suckler bred calves born between July 1st of last year and June 30th of this year. And we're expecting an official announcement fairly shortly from the department on that, we were told. Also at that meeting in Clare, the IFA Rural Development Committee Chair John Curran said that the new Farmers' Charter of Rights is close to being finalised at the moment. That is an agreement between the Department of Agriculture and the main farming organisations, primarily relating to the delivery and standards around schemes and services operated by the department. And John Curran said that the department has agreed to a proposal for up to 48 hours notice to be given to farmers ahead of farm inspections. And he also said that inspectors would have to provide farmers with a short written report on how the inspection went before they leave the yard, which we were told would reduce the stress that these inspections obviously cause to farmers around the country. And there's also going to be a new Agri Appeals Committee, which would allow farmers who are unhappy with the outcome of their inspection to bring an appeal and to air their grievances. And we heard that this committee will now be chaired going forward by an independent person and not somebody who maybe formerly worked for the department. And it's anticipated that this new charter will be published in the coming weeks. Now, moving on to the organic farming scheme now, Charles, and Minister of State Pippa Hackett has confirmed that the 2023 balancing payments under that scheme are going to begin issuing that this week. And over 85% of farmers in the scheme will receive their balancing payments, which will total some €6.8 million. The payments are expected to be in farmers' bank accounts in the coming days, and the department is going to continue to process the remaining cases as a matter of urgency, we were told, as they meet scheme criteria. And very finally from me, Charles, for this week, some good news if you are one of the over 300 farmers that are still awaiting eco scheme payments for 2023. Confirmation this week from the department that these payments will be finalised by June 30th. And to date, eco scheme payments have been made to over 119,000 farmers with a total of €309 million paid out. So some good news there on schemes and some developments over this week, Charles.
That's almost all we have time for. Just before we go, there's one more interesting story we want to draw attention to, and that's the story of Northern Ireland dairy farmer James McKeown, who used his own keen engineering skills to modify his tractor-drawn livestock trailer to make it easier for livestock to enter and exit, with very impressive results. If you want to see James's handiwork, you can check out that story on Agriland.ie or on the Agriland app. But that is all we have time for. Please don't forget to rate, review and follow The Farming Week on Spotify, Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. We'd love if you could spare some time to give us 5 stars and share The Farming Week with anyone you think might be interested. From Aisling and myself, have a great bank holiday weekend.